Elise Denton was 23 years old, completely blind since birth, and standing in the rain outside a courthouse in Harlan County, Kentucky, holding a deed to a collapsed copper mine she had just inherited for $200. The clerk inside had laughed when she signed the papers. He said, "Honey, you just bought yourself a hole in the ground that nobody has touched since 1961. But Elise did not care about what the clerk thought, because 3 hours earlier she had been sitting on a bench at a Greyhound station with $11 in her pocket. No family left to call and nowhere in the world to sleep that night. Let me tell you how she got there. Elise grew up in a single wide trailer outside of Pineville with her grandmother, Ruth. Ruth Denton was the only person who ever treated Elise like she was whole, not broken, not something to pity. Ruth would hold Elise's hands against the kitchen table every morning and say, "Feel that? That is oak. Your grandfather cut this tree himself in 1957. Everything worth knowing, you can know through your hands." Ruth taught her to cook by sound, how oil pops differently when it is ready. She taught her to navigate the trailer by counting steps. 14 steps from the bedroom door to the front porch. 7 steps from the stove to the refrigerator. Ruth made the world small enough that Elise could hold it. But Ruth had a heart that was giving out. Elise could hear it in the way her grandmother paused halfway through sentences to catch her breath. She could feel it in the way Ruth's fingers trembled more each month when she braided Elise's hair. On a Tuesday in November, Ruth died in her recliner, watching Wheel of Fortune. Elise found her because the television was still on at midnight, and Ruth never stayed up past 9. She touched her grandmother's face, and it was already cool. The skin felt like paper that had been left in the cold too long. The funeral cost $2,200 that Elise did not have. Ruth's son, Elise's uncle Dale, showed up at the funeral in a truck he had bought 3 months prior, a brand new Ford with chrome running boards. He wore cologne so strong, Elise could smell him from the back pew. Dale had not visited Ruth in 4 years, had not called in 2. But he showed up with a lawyer and a folder of documents, and within a week he had sold the trailer and the half-acre it sat on. Elise received nothing. Dale told her to her face that a blind girl had no business owning property. He said it the way you would explain something obvious to a child. Then he drove away in that chrome truck, and Elise never heard from him again. She spent 6 weeks sleeping on the couch of a woman from Ruth's church. Then the woman's husband said she had to go. She spent 2 weeks in a shelter in Middlesboro. Then she was on that bench at the Greyhound station, alone in a way that most people will never understand, because Elise could not even see the faces of the strangers walking past her. That was when the letter arrived. Not to the station, of course. It had been forwarded 3 times, from the trailer address to the churchwoman's house to the shelter, and finally a volunteer at the shelter read it to her over the phone. It was from a probate office in Harlan. It said that one Henry Denton, deceased 1987, had left a parcel of property in trust. The trust had been maintained by a small annual fee paid from a forgotten bank account that had finally run dry. The property was a copper mine on the side of Black Mountain. The mine had been sealed and abandoned since 1961 after a partial collapse. Back taxes and fees amounted to $200. If the heir did not claim it within 30 days, the county would absorb the property. Henry Denton was Ruth's husband, Elise's grandfather, the man who had cut the oak tree in 1957 and made it into a kitchen table. The man Ruth spoke about the way people speak about saints, with a voice that went soft and certain at the same time. He had died when Elise was still an infant. She had never known him, but he had left something for her. Elise emptied her bank account. She had $211. She called the probate office and said, "I am claiming that mine." The woman on the phone paused for a long time. She said, "Ma'am, do you understand the condition of the property?" Elise said, "I understand. It is mine." That is how she ended up standing in the rain outside the courthouse, holding a deed she could not read to a place she could not see. She hired a taxi with 9 of her remaining $11. The driver was a man named Curtis, who smelled like menthol cigarettes and motor oil. He did not ask why a blind girl wanted to go to an abandoned mine on Black Mountain. He drove for 40 minutes on roads that got rougher with every mile. Elise felt the car tilt as they climbed. Her ears popped twice. The rain thinned out and the air coming through the cracked window turned colder, sharper, with the metallic smell of wet stone. Curtis stopped the car and said, "This is as far as I can drive. The road is washed out ahead." He paused and then added, "You sure about this?" Elise asked him how far it was to the mine entrance. He said maybe 300 yards up a path to the right. She asked him to describe what he saw. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There is a chain-link fence with a no trespassing sign. Behind it I can see an opening in the rock, maybe 8 feet wide, with timber framing that is mostly rotted. The hillside above it is overgrown with kudzu and blackberry bramble. There is a small building to the left. Looks like it was a supply shed. The roof is caved in. Honestly, ma'am, this place looks like it has been dead a long time." Elise thanked him and got out. She stood there listening as his tires crunched away down the gravel. Then there was silence. Not true silence, because true silence does not exist. There was wind moving through the trees above her. There was water dripping somewhere, a slow, irregular rhythm like a leaking faucet. There were birds, but far away as if they were keeping their distance from this place. She used her cane to find the fence. The chain link was cold and rough with rust. She moved along it until she found the gate, which was held shut by a padlock so corroded it crumbled when she pulled on it. The metal flaked apart in her fingers like old bread. She stepped through. The ground changed under her feet. Packed dirt gave way to loose gravel, then to something smoother, harder. Stone. She could feel the temperature drop as she moved forward, as if she were walking into the mouth of something alive and cold. The smell hit her first, not rot, not decay. It was mineral, ancient, like putting your face close to a riverbed. Wet limestone and copper, and something else underneath. Something she could not name but that made the hair on her arms stand up. She reached the mine entrance and stopped. The timbers were there. She could feel them on either side, rough and splintering under her palms. Beyond them was a space that felt enormous. She could tell because the sound changed. Her footsteps, which had been flat and close on the open hillside, suddenly acquired depth. They echoed. Not far, but enough to tell her that there was a chamber head, a space carved into the mountain itself. Elise stepped inside. The air wrapped around her like a damp cloth. It was 10, maybe 15 degrees colder. The ceiling was low enough that she could feel the presence of rock above her head, a settled pressure that sighted people might not notice, but that Elise felt the way you feel someone watching you. Her cane tapped forward, left, right, center. The floor was surprisingly smooth, worn by decades of boots and cartwheels. She moved slowly, counting her steps the way Ruth had taught her. 10 steps, 20, 30. At 47 steps, she heard it. A sound, distant, rhythmic, coming from somewhere deep inside the mine. It was not dripping water. It was not wind moving through cracks. It was a tapping, metal on stone, a measured, deliberate rhythm. 3 taps, a pause. 3 taps, a pause. Over and over, like a heartbeat made of iron. Elise stood perfectly still. She held her breath. The tapping continued. It was coming from below and ahead of her, deeper in the mine, past where the collapse must have happened. Her rational mind said it was thermal expansion of old pipes, or water dripping on a piece of abandoned equipment in just the right rhythm. But something in her chest, something older than logic, said that this sound was important, that she was meant to hear it. She kept walking. At 60 steps, the floor began to slope downward. At 80, she felt debris under her cane, loose rocks, chunks of timber, the collapse zone. She moved carefully, testing each step before committing her weight. Her fingers brushed the wall to her left and found something unexpected. Leah's smooth wood, not raw timber, but finished wood, like a shelf or a cabinet built into the rock wall. She traced its edges. It was a frame around a small alcove, about 2 feet wide and 18 inches deep. Inside the alcove, her fingers closed around something cold and cylindrical. A metal canister, the kind used to store documents. She unscrewed the lid. Inside was a roll of paper, dry and stiff. She could not read it, but she held it to her nose and smelled old ink, the kind made with walnut and iron gall, her grandfather's generation of ink. She tucked the canister under her arm and kept moving toward the tapping. The tapping grew louder, not by much, but enough to tell her she was getting closer. At 112 steps, she reached what felt like a wall of rubble. The collapse. Rocks piled chest high, timbers jutting at angles. The air here smelled different, dustier, with a copper tang so strong she could taste it on her tongue. But through the gaps in the rubble, the tapping was clear now. 3 taps, pause. 3 taps, pause. And then it changed. 2 taps, pause. 1 tap, pause. 3 taps, a long pause. Then again. 2, 1, 3. Like a code. Like someone on the other side knew she was listening. Elise pressed her hand against the rubble. The rocks vibrated faintly with each tap. She could feel them humming in her palm. And in that moment, standing alone in the dark, that was no different from her usual dark, something broke open inside her. She was not afraid. She was, for the first time since Ruth died, exactly where she was supposed to be. She went back to the surface with the canister. She sat on the ground outside the mine entrance and called the only person she could think of, a woman named Doris who worked at the County Historical Society. Elise had met her once at the shelter when Doris came in to donate blankets. Doris had a voice like warm bread, and she did not treat Elise like glass. Doris came the next morning. She read the papers from the canister aloud, and what she read changed everything Elise thought she knew about her family. The documents were in Henry Denton's handwriting. They were dated June 1961, 2 weeks before the mine was sealed. Henry had written that the copper vein they were mining had unexpectedly opened into a natural cavern system. Inside the cavern, he had found what he called the room, a chamber roughly 40 feet wide and 30 feet tall with walls that contained not just copper, but significant deposits of lithium and rare earth minerals that Henry, a self-taught geologist, recognized as being extraordinarily valuable. He had told no one, not his mining partners, not the company that held the mineral rights, not even Ruth. He had sealed the entrance to the cavern behind a deliberate collapse that he engineered himself. He rigged a section of the support timbers to fail, making it look like an accident. Then he filed the insurance claim, collected the payout, and let the mine be forgotten. He did all of this because the company that owned the mineral rights was Bledsoe Consolidated, owned by a family that had exploited the miners of Harlan County for 3 generations. Henry wrote that they would strip the mountain bare and leave nothing for the people who lived on it. He sealed the treasure inside the mountain and left it in trust for his family, for a time when they would need it and when the Bledsoe rights would have expired. The Bledsoe mineral rights had expired in 2019. 7 years ago, the cavern and everything in it now belonged to whoever owned the surface property. Elise owned the surface property. She sat there on the cold ground with the wind blowing through the blackberry brambles, and she understood. Her grandfather had buried a fortune inside a mountain and waited for his family to find it. He had not told Ruth because Ruth would have told Dale, and Dale would have sold it for quick cash the way he sold the trailer. Henry had trusted time itself to sort out who in the family was worthy, and time had chosen the blind girl with $11 and no place to sleep. But the story was not that simple. It never is. Within a week of filing the mineral survey request with the county, Elise received a phone call from a man named Thomas Bledsoe III. His voice was smooth and educated, the kind of voice that has never been told no. He said he represented a development company that had been monitoring lapsed mineral rights in the region. He said he would like to offer Elise $50,000 for the mine property. When Elise said she was not interested, his voice changed. It got quieter, which was worse than if he had yelled. He said, "Miss Denton, I want you to understand something. That mountain has been in my family's interest for 70 years. We have attorneys who specialize in property disputes. The collapse of 1961 was never properly investigated. If we find that it was deliberately caused, any claims arising from the property could be voided due to fraud. I would take the $50,000. Elise hung up. 3 days later, someone cut the chain link fence around the mine and drove a vehicle up the path. Elise knew because Curtis, the taxi driver who had driven her up the first time and who had come back the next day with a sleeping bag and a thermos of coffee because he said he could not stop thinking about the blind girl on the mountain. Curtis found the tire tracks. He described them to Elise. Wide tread, heavy vehicle. They had gone up to the mine entrance and come back. Nothing appeared to be taken, but the alcove where the canister had been was empty of anything else. Whoever it was had been looking for Henry's documents. Elise almost quit. She sat in the supply shed, which Curtis had patched up enough to keep the rain out, and she thought about what it would mean to fight a family with lawyers and money in sight. She thought about how she had never won anything in her life, how Ruth had died, tired and poor, how Dale had taken what little they had, how the world was built for people who could see, and she would always be stumbling through it with her hands out. That night, she dreamed about Ruth. Not a mystical dream, not a visitation, just Ruth in the kitchen, her hands covered in flour, saying something she had said 100 times when Elise was growing up. She said, "Elise, your eyes do not work, but your ears are a gift. You hear things other people miss because they are too busy looking." In the dream, Ruth was smiling, and the kitchen smelled like biscuits and bacon grease, and for a moment everything was warm. Elise woke up and went back into the mine. She went back to the collapse. She pressed her hands against the rubble, and she listened. The tapping was there. 3, pause, 3, pause. But now she listened differently. She listened the way Ruth had taught her to listen, not for the obvious sound, but for what was underneath it. And underneath the tapping, she heard water. Running water, moving fast somewhere behind the rock, which meant the cavern system was not just a pocket but connected to underground streams. And underneath the water, she heard a low harmonic hum, a vibration in the rock itself, the kind of sound that crystals make when they are dense enough and large enough to resonate. She was listening to the mountain sing. Elise spent 4 months on that mountain. Curtis became her eyes. He was 58 years old, divorced, with a daughter in Lexington who called him twice a year. He had been driving a taxi for 11 years, and he said it was the first time a fare had given him a reason to come back. He brought supplies up in his car. Tarps, tools, canned food, batteries. Elise paid him nothing because she had nothing, and he never asked. Doris from the Historical Society became her researcher. She dug through county records and found the original mining surveys from 1959. She found that Henry Denton had been listed as the lead surveyor, not just a miner. He had been the one who mapped the tunnels. Doris also found something else. A letter from Henry to the county recorder dated 1961 requesting that the surface property be separated from the mineral rights and placed in an independent trust. The county had processed it and forgotten about it. This single piece of paper was the legal firewall Henry had built. The surface rights and the mineral rights were distinct. Even if Bledsoe challenged the mineral rights, Elise owned the surface, and under Kentucky law, any natural cavern accessible only from the surface belonged to the surface owner. Henry Denton, a man with an 8th grade education who taught himself geology from library books, had outwarred the Bledsoes 65 years before the fight even started. Elise began clearing the collapse. Not all of it. Not even most of it. She worked with her hands, pulling out rocks one at a time, feeling for the stable pieces and the dangerous ones. Curtis helped when he could, but his back was bad, and he could only do so much. She developed a system. She would tap the rocks with a small hammer and listen to how they rang. Solid, settled rocks had a low, dead sound. Loose ones that might bring more debris down had a higher, almost musical ping. She sorted them by sound. She built a path through the rubble the way a surgeon works through tissue, carefully, by feel. By the 3rd month, she had cleared a passage 4 feet wide and 3 feet tall. She crawled through on her hands and knees. The air on the other side was different. Cooler, moving. She could feel a breeze on her face, which meant the cavern connected to an air source somewhere. And the tapping was loud now, not mechanical, not man-made. It was water droplets falling from stalactites onto a mineral formation below. Each drop hit a different surface and produced a different tone. 3 drops on one formation. Pause as the drip cycle reset. 3 drops again. The pattern she had been hearing for months was the mountain breathing, its water cycle playing a rhythm on its own mineral keys. But there was something else in that chamber. Elise could feel it. The air had a weight to it, a density. She crawled forward and her hand touched something smooth and cold. Not stone, metal. She traced its shape. It was a box, welded shut, about the size of a small suitcase. Heavy. She dragged it back through the passage and into the daylight she could not see. Curtis opened it with a hacksaw. "Hannah." Inside was a second set of documents wrapped in oilcloth, and beneath the documents, arranged in rows like soldiers, were sample cores. 12 metal cylinders, each one containing a cross-section of the mineral deposits from the cavern. Henry had labeled each one in careful handwriting that Doris read aloud. Copper, lithium, cerium, neodymium, lanthanum. The rare earth elements that in 1961 were geological curiosities and in 2026 were the most valuable minerals on the planet, essential for every battery, every phone, every electric vehicle. Doris went quiet. Curtis went quiet. Elise could feel their silence like a change in pressure. She asked, "How much?" Doris said, "Elise, I am not a geologist. But if those samples are representative of what is in that cavern, we are not talking about thousands. We are not talking about hundreds of thousands. A lithium and rare earth deposit of this size, accessible from a single entry point on private land with clear title and no competing mineral claims. I think we are talking about something that would make you one of the wealthiest landowners in eastern Kentucky." Elise did not react the way you might expect. She did not gasp or cry or laugh. She sat very still and she listened. She listened to the wind in the trees and the birds that had gotten closer over the months, as if they were no longer afraid of this place. She listened to Curtis breathing heavily from the effort of cutting the box open. She listened to the drip of water somewhere behind her, the mine exhaling its ancient breath. And then she said, "I want to talk to Thomas Bledsoe." The meeting happened in a conference room in Harlan. Bledsoe brought 2 attorneys. Elise brought Doris and the lawyer from the Appalachian Citizens Law Center, who had taken her case pro bono after Doris made some calls. Elise wore the same clothes she had been wearing on the mountain, work boots caked with red clay and a flannel shirt with a torn pocket. She did not bring the sample cores. She did not bring the documents. Bledsoe started talking about his offer. He had raised it to $200,000. His lawyers mentioned the fraud investigation. They mentioned the cost of litigation. They said, very politely, that a blind woman living in a shed on a mountain was not in a strong negotiating position. Elise let them finish. Then she said, "Mr. Bledsoe, your family held mineral rights to that mountain for 60 years. In that time, you never once sent anyone inside to survey what was actually there. You collected lease payments from the county and you let the mine rot. You did not care what was in that mountain because you did not need to. You were already rich. My grandfather went into that mountain every day for 9 years. He mapped every tunnel with his own hands. He found what you were too comfortable to look for. And then he sealed it shut because he knew that if you found it, you would strip this mountain the way your grandfather stripped the people who worked in it." The room was very quiet. She continued, "Your mineral rights expired in 2019. The surface rights are mine. The cavern is accessible only from my surface entry. I have had 3 independent geologists review the sample cores in the last 2 weeks." She was bluffing about the geologists. She had sent the samples out 4 days ago and had no results yet. But Thomas Bledsoe did not know that. She said, "I am not going to sell you this mountain. I am not going to sell it to anyone. What I am going to do is develop it responsibly, hire locally, and make sure that the wealth from this mountain stays in this county. You can fight me in court if you want, but I think you know that the law is on my side. And I think you know that a story about a billion-dollar company trying to take a mine from a blind girl who inherited it from her grandfather is the kind of story that ends up on the news. Bledsoe and his lawyers left without saying another word. Weeks passed. The geologist confirmed what Henry had known 65 years earlier. The deposit was significant, not the largest in the country, but rich enough and pure enough to attract serious interest from ethical mining companies. Elise formed a cooperative with the help of the Law Center. She brought in Curtis as the operations manager because he knew every road and every person in the county. She hired Doris as the community liaison. She structured the deal so that 30% of the profits would go into a trust for Harlan County, funding schools and clinics and the kinds of things that the Bledsoes had never bothered to fund in 70 years. The supply shed became a real structure. Curtis and a crew of local volunteers rebuilt it with proper walls and a tin roof that sang when it rained. Elise lived in it. She did not want a mansion or even a proper house. She wanted to be close to the mine. She wanted to wake up every morning and walk 47 steps to the entrance and stand there and listen. The tapping never stopped. Water on stone, the mountain's perpetual rhythm. But now Elise understood it. And understanding did not make it less beautiful. It made it more so. One evening, 6 months after she had first arrived on the mountain, Doris brought her a final document she had found in the county archives. It was a letter from Henry Denton to a person identified only as "my darling girl." It was dated 1987, the year Henry died. Doris read it aloud, her voice unsteady. Henry wrote, "I know I will not live to see you. Ruth tells me we have a granddaughter on the way. She tells me the doctors say the baby will be born without sight. I have thought about this for many days, and I want you to know what I believe. I believe that God does not take something without giving something in return. You will not see the mountain, but you will hear it. And if you listen carefully, it will tell you everything I could not. I have left something inside the mountain for you. It is not the copper or the minerals or whatever else they will someday find valuable. It is the sound. When you stand inside the mountain and you hear the water falling on the stone, you are hearing the same sound I heard on the day I decided to seal the entrance. It is the sound of the earth keeping a promise. I made a promise too. I promised that this mountain would take care of my family. I am trusting time to deliver this letter to the right person. If you are reading this, then time kept its promise. And so did I. Elise did not cry. She pressed the letter against her chest, and she breathed in the old paper and the mountain air and the faint ghost of walnut ink. She walked into the mine. 47 steps. She stood in the dark that was no different from her usual dark, and she listened. The water fell. The stone answered. 3 drops. Pause. 3 drops. Pause. She placed her hand on the cavern wall and felt the hum of the earth beneath her palm. It was warm, not from any geological process she could name, but warm like skin, like a hand held too long under a blanket. She whispered, "I hear you, Grandpa." The mountain did not answer in words. In Everett the way, mountains always answer, in time, in patience, in the slow accumulation of mineral and water, and pressure that turns nothing into something, that turns stone into song. Elise Denton was 23 years old. She was blind. She owned a collapsed mine on the side of Black Mountain in Harlan County, Kentucky. And she was, at last, home. Some people spend their whole lives looking for a place where they belong. Some people have to stop looking and start listening. Because sometimes the place that was meant for you has been calling your name for 65 years, waiting in the dark, patient as stone, trusting that you would come, trusting that you would hear it, trusting that you would hear it, trusting that even without eyes, you would find your way in.